Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. And thank you, Maya, for inviting us to present our work in your space. We're really excited to be here. And thanks to ACME as well for all the great work that you do. So we're presenting our webinar today on this intro to trauma-informed pedagogy. I'm Anita Chari, just to make sure you know who's who, and I'm here with Angelica Singh. And I just want to begin by talking with you about what we're going to be doing in the webinar today and what we want to cover. So, we really want to talk about what kinds of challenges the pandemic has posed for teaching and learning in this moment as we are heading into an academic year that is really full of uncertainty for so many of us. In this webinar, we want to discuss the immediate pressures that the pandemic is creating for us, as well as, along with that, the movements against anti-Black violence and what kinds of pressures these events have created for teaching and learning, as well as the resources that we've developed for responding to them. And so first, we'll be exploring why the pressures of our current moment demand trauma-informed tools in the classroom. Secondly, we'll be talking about, what is trauma, defining trauma, and defining trauma-informed pedagogy. What do we mean by this? And then thirdly, we're going to introduce tools for beginning to work with trauma in the classroom in a very practical way that you can even begin to work with now as you are perhaps heading into your classrooms in the coming days or weeks. And these tools are drawn from our program, which is called Embodying Your Curriculum, as Maya was speaking to. And at the end of the webinar, we'll be talking a bit just about the program to give you some more information about the longer program that we offer. All right, so we want to talk about really what it means to meet this moment. We know that students confront extraordinary challenges right now due to the pandemic. COVID-19 has amplified existing economic and racial inequalities, and it means that many of our students are dealing with higher levels of anxiety, with social isolation, with depression, and this is all happening as we're in a moment where we have to learn how to teach, and also they have to learn a new way of learning online. And in our view, there's really no going back to normal. I think most of us have accepted this, that we're in this place for the long haul, but that actually this moment gives us tremendous opportunities to innovate and to participate in broader social change within universities if we really respond to this moment creatively, if we accept the fact that these challenges and what is really in many ways a breakdown of the traditional paradigms that we've been working with in higher education for a long while are going to need to change. And so the question that we come to this with is, how can professors meet this moment in the classroom as we ourselves are overwhelmed by this context? We ourselves as educators are dealing with overwhelm in our personal lives, in our professional lives, needing to hold space for something that is very much unknown. How can we resource ourselves in that and meet this moment? So I think one thing that is really important to speak to is that there's a tremendous amount of insecurity over basic needs that our students are facing. I think some of these statistics are really quite striking. Nearly 60% of respondents in a recent survey by the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice said that 60% of students had experienced insecurity of basic needs in the 30 days prior to taking the survey. And I think if we break that down by the racial background of students, you can see that 71% of Black students said that they were experiencing basic needs insecurity. And 1/3 of students who were working before the pandemic said they had lost a job. Beyond that, I think it's really important to pay attention to the fact that of this statistic, which at the bottom of this slide, which says that half of the students surveyed said they had experienced moderate anxiety, and a similar proportion said that they couldn't focus on academics during the pandemic. So I think that what that shows us is that all that is happening in the pandemic is really not just something that we can understand as a mental health challenge. It is also very much a challenge for learning, something that calls into question what learning means and what are the conditions under which it can happen, given these conditions of really tremendous insecurity over basic needs that our students are facing. Then if we move to consider what all of this means in light of the movements against anti-Black violence that have surfaced since May, We've seen the beginnings of the most passionate and powerful political protests against racial and anti-Black violence that we've seen since the 1960s. And we know that our students, in many cases, have been a driving force in these protests. But even as that's the case, and it's a moment, as we know, that's both inspiring and in very many ways destabilizing and challenging. Many of our Black, Indigenous, and POC students are recapitulating traumatic experiences from their past, both from their personal lives as well as from historical memory. So, you know, there's a real need to reckon with the fact that the depths of historical anti-Black violence and oppression is being understood across society, arguably in a new way in this moment, which gives us an opportunity to deepen our conversations about privilege, about power, about inclusion within academia and what that really means in a substantive way. But I think at the same time, we have to recognize the deep challenges that that poses, especially for students of color. And so I want to raise some statistics that speak to that. If we look at this slide, depression and anxiety in the wake of the police killing of George Floyd spiked among African Americans. And not only actually among African Americans, also among other racial groups such as Asian Americans. But we can see that it's actually quite a tremendous spike on the part of African Americans. And that's not surprising, I don't think. But I think it's something that we absolutely need to take into account as we have conversations about race in this moment in our classrooms. What is that bringing up for our students, right? How can we hold for the fact that historical trauma is actually resurfacing in this moment in our classrooms? So just to say that I think we want to just make clear that we really are dealing with a situation of tremendous overwhelm in this current moment on the part of students, as well as on the part of faculty and administrators. And we're dealing with this overwhelm while adjusting to teaching and learning in a time where we're physically distanced, where we don't actually have the same kind of social contact that we might usually be used to and which we would rely on in our classrooms. And so, as I was saying before, I think this means that we need to really consider what kinds of new tools do we need to bring into our classrooms to support both ourselves and our students in this moment. And, you know, to our universities prepared for this, I think is a question that's on all of our minds. You know, I think these headlines speak to so many different aspects of this issue. First of all, we see that there are many, you know, there are a large number of professors who actually are facing a deep amount of fear of going back into the classroom for very good reasons. Beyond that, we know that students are facing psychological issues and mental health challenges during and after COVID. And that there's really the issue of overwhelm that we're dealing with on all dimensions of our populations within the universities. And then beyond that, I think you know, we need to think about how this moment causes us to need to revise what really we think learning means, right? What's the relationship of our embodied experience to learning? What does it mean to create a healthy learning environment? I think all of these are things that this moment really forces us to consider. And so our solution, our belief about how we can meet this moment is really that first, we need to resource professors and students with pedagogies that are going to address this overwhelm in the classroom head on, so that what is absolutely a social crisis and an economic crisis does not need to become a learning crisis or a mental health crisis. Secondly, we need to give professors the tools to work with racialized trauma in the online classroom, so that we minimize the recapitulation that's happening of our Black, Indigenous, and POC students as trauma. And also so that we can deepen our conversations about race, power, and privilege, so that we can have a deeper understanding in light of what's surfacing in our society right now, and also so that we can reduce race-based disparities in online learning. And then finally, we believe that we have to think about how to create practices of social connection and nervous system regulation in these online classrooms that we find ourselves in right now. A lot of the conversation about online learning, from what I've noticed, has been very technical in a lot of ways. It's been about how can we do this effectively using certain platforms, or, you know, really getting the techniques of online learning down, which is absolutely important in its own way. But, you know, our feeling is that what we might be overlooking in this overly technical conversation is the deeper point, which is that right now, in the midst of all this overwhelm, we really need to create spaces for social connection online, because that's where we're at. We're online, and so we need to learn how to do that, and you know, resource professors with the tools to do that. So now I'm going to turn it over to Angelica, who's going to speak to what's at the root of all this, essentially.
Hi there. So I'm Angelica, and my background really is a trauma background, a trauma resolution background. So being able to have a lot of experience in this realm helped me to really understand kind of what's at the root. And trauma is something, it's a word that we use a lot. I think diagnosticians often use this word, and I would like to break it down for you so that we have a better understanding of really what does that mean from somebody who works with trauma and works to resolve trauma in individuals and in groups. And I also educate other people about how to work with it. So trauma is the root of overwhelm for both individuals and groups. And what happens to people, either as an individual or as a group, is that their nervous system gets overwhelmed at some point in their life, in their history, and they're unable to process that overwhelm because the energy coming at them has been so intense that it caused a compression in their nervous system. So what happens is that we often get stuck on or stuck on off. And trauma builds on itself. So it can actually start to amplify by stacking one experience of overwhelm on top of another. And that is really what we call recapitulation or capitulating, because the nervous system is unable to completely discharge those earlier experiences. And what that sets up are survival strategies of fight or flight. That's a term that we're familiar with. And levels of disconnect from actually being able to settle and regulate. So when we are stressed by a current situation, a pandemic, an economic crisis, a racial injustice issue of violence, climate change, all of these things start to really impact us and compress on, and they're both individual and they're also collective. So one of the ways in which we look at collective trauma, we could think of epigenetic trauma. That means that we look at the historical or the transgenerational trauma of a person, meaning if their families were enslaved or they were in a genocide, and that includes different forms of racialized trauma. So these are things that we already bring to the table. Take away the pandemic, take away the economic crisis. We already bring to the table some version of overwhelm. So a good way to think about trauma is to think about overwhelm that is, and trauma is energy that's not discharged out of the nervous system. So what I like to think of is like we have a boiling point, and some of us are very regulated and able to incur things, and then the water will start to boil. Some of us are at a boiling point and we start to create steam as a metaphor for understanding what overwhelm and stuck on looks like. When we're in those states of overwhelm, we don't learn, we don't connect, and we have a hard time focusing on anything other than our basic needs, and we're stuck in fight or flight often, or even a freeze. Did you? Yeah. So here's just a definition I spoke a little bit about, but I want to highlight the fact that overwhelm is, or trauma is anything that is too much, too soon, or too fast for the nervous system to handle. So that's the way in which the nervous system gets overwhelmed. What we do, because our nervous systems are intelligent, is they will congeal, the nervous system will congeal that energy and hold it in the body as a way of protecting the brain and the complete regulation of the system. So the other component that happens when we've been traumatized is that because there's such strong overwhelm, there's an absence of witness. That really includes being seen and being heard, and how that overwhelms and congeals in the system is because there was that lack of witness, that lack of being able to feel a container that would have helped us discharge the energy and begin to regulate again. So that nervous system energy then gets held in order for us to survive. So this is an act of grace of the nervous system. It's an act of intelligence to congeal the energy. It is not something that is not health, part of the health of who we are. But when you start compiling them and compressing them, we start to have very strong impacts to our perception, and we have a strong impact to our overall health, our immune systems, our ability to leverage and connect with others and be able to even open to that witness place, that it would allow us to feel acknowledged in our pain, in feeling seen and heard. So I think if you really sit with this just for a moment, you can understand at a very basic level how all of these things create overwhelm, and how we disconnect and begin to polarize away from each other because we are all dealing with overwhelm, and our strategies for survival often disconnect us from some very basic needs of contact and a sense of regulation, and we often don't even know what to ask for, which is often that we need to be seen and heard so that that energy can move through us and we can be understood, and we don't have to keep carrying it around. So here's a basic look at a healthy nervous system, just at a very basic graphic level. Okay, that went very fast. I don't know if they saw it that way, but typically it's more like this. I think that might just be a technical piece of how it's translating through this platform. But you can see there's arousal, sympathetic, which is our sympathetic nervous system. That's the active alert. It also includes fight or flight, but it's also a very healthy part of our nervous systems. And there's a sense of settling. So I'll give you, excuse me, just a basic example. Let's say you're sleeping very soundly and the alarm goes off and you were in a deep sleep and you get that startle response. That's the sympathetic nervous system, and sometimes it's far more jarring than we would like, and so that can make us feel a little agitated or irritated, or the heart rate goes up. And then we get into the bathroom and we realize we have an hour and not half an hour, and we get into the shower and we feel the warm water on our body and we start to settle again down into parasympathetic. And then you get in your car and you're ready to go and you're drinking your coffee and somebody stops in front of you quickly and you put on the brakes and you go back, spike up into sympathetic, right? And you get coffee on yourself and then you're in that state, and then you're, oh God, this happened, and you're trying to discharge that, and then a song comes on the radio that you really love and it settles you again. So that just gives you a very basic example of what a sympathetic arousal with settling can happen. So even though those were a bit alert, that's still pretty much in what we will call the window of tolerance, the range of what we can be healthy in our arousal states, and then down regulation. So when we have a discharged or undischarged traumatic experience, we can see that there's overwhelm, we can see that healthy curve, and we can see that we spike in a way that is not a very comfortable, and it's definitely an overwhelming experience. So we can see that the normal range of where we would live in the window of tolerance, we're starting to go outside of that window of tolerance. And that really creates dissociative states. Those states of overwhelm are literally keeping the boiling temperature at us at boiling temperature. So just some common symptoms might be grinding your teeth, locking your jaw when you're sleeping, insomnia, physical pain during the day, chest tightening, feeling like your mind doesn't go off. So we're all familiar with these states because we've all had some version of stress and have experienced states of overwhelm. That's normal. These are overwhelm, and to some degree trauma is normal. Part of life is the challenge of learning how to deal with these things. So part of what we're offering in understanding this, and what we're coming to recognize just as students, as professors in these environments, is that we're always dealing with these things, and we all have them. And so now more than ever, it becomes really a value to understand, what does it mean to have a settled nervous system? How do we drive the human beingness of our car in a way that optimizes its intelligence? It optimizes our ability to connect and downregulate and have healthy connection to ourselves and to others, so that we can provide a circumstance for learning, a circumstance for creativity, a circumstance for new ideas and perceptions, which is really what learning is all about, isn't it? Creating possibilities and offering tools that support us to grow in resiliency emotionally, so that we support that intelligence to grow in other ways. We are left and right brain people, and we are bodies. And the body piece really helps us bring a foundation for learning. So I would like to walk you through just a little bit of a practice right now, just to give you a sense of how we begin to regulate the nervous system, and to begin to offer that resource and support that help us, not only as teachers, but as human beings, begin to connect in with, how do I bring teaching to states of overwhelm when I myself am overwhelmed? So if you can just take a moment and get comfortable in your seat. I'm going to get a little comfortable too. And if you can, put your feet on the floor. Go ahead and close your eyes. And just allow yourself to take a moment. So we were all perhaps looking at the screen, and there's a certain level of intensity of just having to focus. So now just bringing your attention really back to yourself. Allowing yourself to gently prompt your awareness back into your own being. And just noticing what you sense, where you are just now, before you really practice anything else, just getting the lay of the land in your body. You might notice that your energy is up more towards your head and your ears, because you were listening with your ears and your head. So wherever you are, just begin to settle in to what we're going to call your sits bones, or your seat, whatever you're sitting on, your pelvis. Feeling the contact you're making with the chair, or the couch, or wherever you're sitting. So allowing the weight of your being to become more obvious. Noticing if you feel that you're sitting more forward or more back in your seat. Do you feel more the left or the right side of your pelvis? And just invite and gently prompt your whole body just to slow down, deepen down into your pelvis. And allow your awareness to go down even further into your feet. So you could imagine that your awareness can drop down the way a rock drops down through water. Just taking your time, allowing it to move down at its own pace, one that is more fluid, coming down to the ground, into your feet. Noticing the contact your feet are making with the floor. Noticing if you feel more the left or the right foot more. And you're just observing. And just ever so slowly, just take your right foot and push the ball of your right foot into the ground. And release. And again, just pushing very slowly the ball of the right foot into the ground, as though we're imperceptible to the outside. And release. And just shifting now to the left foot, pushing the ball of the foot in again. And then release. And again, pushing the ball of the left foot in the ground. And release. Let's take a moment to feel your pelvis again. And I'd like you to slowly begin to open your eyes, but keeping your eyes soft and not coming to the screen right away, but just having a look around and beginning to orient to the room that you're sitting in. You might feel that you want to take a deep breath. And just to yourself, just naming quietly or inside what you see in your room, the place you're sitting, just to bring orientation into the room and into the moment. And when you're ready, you can come back to the screen. So these are just a very, very simple skill of slowing down and grounding. And the nervous system feels very nourished and begins to understand that, oh, there's regulation. There is attention to finding states where I can be open to receive and feel supported in the learning and facilitation dynamic that goes on between two people, between multiple people in a room, just slowing down and grounding. So this is where we start. And it's a very basic skill and yet a very profound skill that causes a lot of nesting and foundation for us to be able to connect with each other in a more regulated way and begins to address the overwhelm. You can imagine this is a muscle that builds over time, and cumulatively it creates a tremendous capacity to bring resilience and perceptual shifts, meaning we have more possibilities to be creative in a classroom. And of course, we're doing this online. So we expand on this in our course in order to give you more tools for learning how to bring this to an online platform where you're able to connect with people even though you're not in the room with them. So this is just the basic skill we discussed. I basically told you all of this already, but we can just review it briefly. The components of this skill are autonomic regulation. What we talked about in terms of co-regulation is being able to be in relationship with others and to actually address from a foundational place what activation is. Being able to understand that when we're capitulating overwhelm, we're all a little activated, what I like to call a rev. The nervous system is in a rev. You can imagine if you've ever driven a stick shift or even been in your car and park and press the gas, you know what a rev feels like in your body, right? Just imagine you're in park and you're pressing the gas. So that's an experience of dysregulation in a nervous system. And we can bring that boiling temperature down and increase the window of tolerance by using simple tools. And we don't have to become therapists and delve into people's traumas to meet someone in their nervous system functionality, in their capacity, because we're coming to this from a place of health, not from a place of diagnostic assessment. We're coming at it from meeting you in your health. It's good coaching, it's good support to be able to understand the whole of a person, the whole being of a human being, of what we need in order to create conditions and circumstances that we learn under. And it would be great if all of this, we didn't have to wait until moments of pandemics and overwhelm, because this is something that really is just about being, how to be a human being 101, how to drive the car of your intelligence and to function within that so that you have the maximum optimal potential that's available to you. And this is the foundational skill for nervous system regulation, whether or not you have trauma or just layers of overwhelm because of the situation. So go ahead.
Do you want me to jump in here, Angelica?
Yeah,
Or?
you go ahead. Yeah.
So we wanted to, bring this also then to the dimension of thinking about how trauma works in the collective, right? We're in this moment really where racialized trauma is such an important thing for us to be talking about right now. And we wanted to present this quote from Resmaa Menakem that speaks to this, really, that speaks to this point. So I'm just going to read the quote. He says, "We need to begin with the healing of trauma in dark-skinned bodies, light-skinned bodies, our neighborhoods and communities, and the law enforcement profession. Social and political actions are essential, but they need to be part of a larger strategy of healing, justice, and creating room for growth in traumatized flesh and blood bodies." So all that Angelica was speaking to, I think, how we can extend that also in light of what Menakem is saying here is that really all of this is a matter of is a collective matter, right? We often think about overwhelm in a very individualized way, and I think what we realize now, as Angelica was speaking to, in this moment of the pandemic and in racial reckoning, that absolutely this is not an individual issue, it's a collective issue. And it's certainly an issue that we need to be dealing with in our classrooms for that reason. And part of the reason for that is that when we have, as Angelica was speaking to, when we have unprocessed historical and personal trauma, the layering of that really creates a situation within our classrooms in which we really don't have the conditions to connect to one another, to have conversations that are deeply creative and where we truly can see and hear one another. And so we really believe that it's time for us to start having a bigger conversation in universities about how trauma and overwhelm, as Angelica was speaking to, at many levels is impacting learning. And it's also impacting our ability to be truly inclusive in our classrooms and in our institutions, even as we say that we want to be. And so trauma-informed pedagogy, we believe, has been necessary for a long time, to be honest. But I think in this moment of the pandemic, it's more necessary than ever to learn how to create social connection in our classrooms and to prioritize it as we're teaching online in the midst of these twin pressures of the pandemic and the protests. And so I want to speak now about what do we mean then by trauma-informed pedagogy? What does it mean to take into account overwhelm and trauma in our classrooms? And so where I would begin with that is to say that trauma-informed pedagogy is about really recognizing that the effects of historical trauma, of social trauma, racial and personal, are all held within our nervous systems. And they're held within our nervous systems as patterns that surface and resurface. And Angelica spoke to how that works in terms of a rev in our nervous system, in terms of the inability to turn our nervous systems off, right? We get stuck on. These patterns play out in our classrooms, and they can impact our ability to take in new information, which is fundamental to what we would think of as learning. It also impacts our ability to truly empathize with one another and to have creative conversations, as well as to have a creative relationship to the material that we're studying. So trauma-informed pedagogy is about taking into account the relationship between these patterns, really, and our ability to learn. And beyond that, trauma-informed pedagogy really recognizes that bodily awareness and social engagement are going to be the pathways to be able to access and transform the patterns that live in our nervous system. And that actually the classroom is really a wonderful place for us to be able to do this work. And as Angelica was saying, the work that this involves is not therapeutic work. It's actually really, I think within our classrooms in universities, we have an amazing opportunity to unify and integrate and bring together the social and political conversations that we have within universities that really are unlike the kinds of conversations that we can have almost anywhere else in society, to bring that together with bodily awareness and a recognition of the fact that historical trauma lives in our classrooms now, lives in our bodies now, as we talk with each other and as we have theoretical and intellectual conversations about these issues.
Can I say something just about that?
Yeah.
So I think that what Anita is saying is so important, because if you consider that perhaps in the past we are intellectually offering information about historical traumas, but to actually include the understanding that that trauma is living in a student's body and that it's living in all of our bodies in some way is not to delve into it. It's just to say, I see you, I get you, and I'm going to see you through the way that I'm offering this class. The way that I'm going to facilitate you is to meet you in that place without and dignifying who you might be and where you come from. That's really the point of a trauma-informed pedagogy, is to understand the social and historical imprinting that each person comes with that's different, and to offer them dignity in their own transformation, not only through learning, but through a coursework experience, through an experiential room where we really are learning. And that's the way that we move into innovating culture and innovating connection between various backgrounds, historical backgrounds, social backgrounds, cultural backgrounds.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Angelica. And just to build on that point that Angelica was just making, what that means really is that trauma-informed, to speak to what trauma-informed pedagogy is not, it doesn't, just as Angelica was saying, it doesn't mean we have to delve into people's personal trauma, right? What it really is, it's not about making professors into therapists. What it's about is really understanding that we all have a certain level of dysregulation already happening, that's already present for most all of us, our students as well as faculty, and to acknowledge it within our classroom creates resiliency. Rather than actually, it doesn't create chaos within our classroom, it actually creates resiliency for us to include all of these parts of ourselves and our students. And it actually creates a powerful opportunity to connect in the midst of all the challenges and the trauma that we have. That is a collective matter. It's not really an individual matter in a lot of ways. It's something that we need to reckon with as a society and as a collective. So, I would just say that, for a lot of my experience with bringing trauma-informed pedagogy into the university context has been within the context of prison education. And I think that, one thing that I've noticed is that you can have a room full of people that actually have very challenging histories, that have undergone a tremendous amount of trauma. And yet, when you use trauma-informed pedagogies, what the consequence and the effect of that is not to disrupt your classroom with people's trauma spilling around in the classroom, but actually it's to create greater resiliency and a deeper level of communication, because people do feel seen and heard, and they feel more comfortable with sharing with one another and more available for connection. So, with these tools of trauma-informed pedagogy, I truly believe that it's possible to deepen learning during this time, and we absolutely need to deepen learning right now in the midst of what we're going through in our society, and to really change our paradigms around what we think learning is. So we wanted to talk a little bit, so we're going to leave plenty of time for questions that, and Maya will field the questions through the chat. But we wanted to just take some time right now to tell you a little bit about our longer program that we're doing, which offers all of these tools that we'll be presenting today, and these concepts come from our longer program called Embodying Your Curriculum, which is a 4-module program that we teach over the course of a 6-week course. And so these are the modules that we have in the course. Angelica, do you want to start with module 1 and 2, and then I'll talk about the other 2?
Sure. So in the first module, we actually did a little piece of that, which was we showed you the basic skill of slowing down and grounding. We start really around the fundamentals of nervous system regulation. And the first 2 modules are really to support you. If you're a faculty member or your professor, there's no way to be able to facilitate others for their overwhelm if you yourself are overwhelmed. So we really take the time to offer not only the education for understanding what's happening and how to have different perspectives about the level of conflict and overwhelm, and how to really tap the resiliency, not only at a personal level for you, but for how do you bring that to a classroom? At first, it's like, you got to put your own oxygen mask on first before you put it on somebody else. So the first part is really to give you a deep dive into what are your needs and meeting those needs by helping you regulate your own nervous system and understand what resourcing yourself really does. So that creates a level of connection and a sense that you can actually use online platforms to connect socially and to be able to use different tools of resiliency, particularly social resiliency, in an online classroom, and skills like inquiry and the nuanced way in which you ask questions and the ways in which you glean personal anecdotal connection to your students and from yourself in a way that allows for connection to occur even though it's an online platform. And the first step is is to be able to get your own overwhelm, the volume down, and the boiling temperature down, so it increases your own window of tolerance and understanding that at a deeper level.
And then we move in modules 3 and 4 to then thinking about what is known as the social nervous system, which is a term coined by the neuroscientist Stephen Porges, which really talks about the importance of the social, of connection, of the kind of contact that we can have in collectives when we're all seen and heard, and we have the potential to downregulate and settle our nervous systems together. What opens up really is the possibility of deeper connection. And also that deeper connection within our classrooms actually is what gives us the opportunity to settle our nervous systems at a deeper level. And beyond that, in modules 3 and 4, we really think about then what does trauma mean, overwhelm, what do trauma and overwhelm mean really on the collective levels, not just on the personal levels, right? Often in our society, we tend to think of trauma as being a very individualized thing. And in fact, the whole thrust of our course is really to connect those dimensions fundamentally and to think about the collective dimension of this. And then in module 4, we think about trauma and group dynamics in terms of issues of power, inclusion, social repair, and resiliency. So that our conversations about trauma can also include conversations about history, about racialized trauma, about power dynamics, about how all of these things play out in our classrooms. Right now, as we're having deeper conversations really about what does it mean really to create an inclusive classroom? What does it mean to be able to have conversations about race and power and anti-Blackness in this moment? How can we give our students the tools to really deepen those conversations, even as their own historical material from their own histories is coming up?
So the tools that are offered in each module really bring a level of connection to fundamental ways that deepen connection and learning in the classroom that do not have to address or have to bring in these large emotional pieces. The emotion is a part of life, right? That's already happening in classrooms everywhere. It's really about creating a web, and a very strong web that catches all of the things that we often exclude from these difficult conversations. And when it's woven into a classroom and into the tapestry of learning in in an environment of a university, it can deepen the resiliency as a group and personally, without it becoming some kind of trauma-based experience. We use the word trauma because that's where these skills were first utilized and what we kind of understand as nomenclature. But this is really about learning and really about allowing the brain and our nervous systems to function at optimal paces and optimal places because we're not overwhelmed. And how do we offer that in a very embodied way, where we're not going into the psychological history of a person, and yet we're discussing history all the time and what the impact is of that. So how do we use inquiry? How do we use resources? How do we create dyads and triads and conversations that actually delve into that material and without excluding that there are huge emotional and mental perceptual experiences, and really include that in a way that brings resiliency and a netting to catch people and to connect them, instead of forcing or compelling people to leave that out of their learning experience, particularly in a time where we have to meet the moment of addressing things. So to offer students, if you're a professor, new ways to use the technology to support them to connect with themselves and with each other is a way in which we upgrade their experience for learning as well.
And as the Resmaa Menakem quote that we presented before underlines, and I think it's an important thing to remember, all of this is really connected with how social change happens. So in reality, we really see this work as being connected to a broader conversation that we need to have in universities about how to participate in social change, how to participate in
That's right.
creating
Right.
racial
How do
justice.
we, yes, how do we innovate the conversation from the places where these conversations are often birthed in all kinds of ways, creative ways, literary ways, psychological ways, historical ways, all of the ways in which we innovate conversations and discussions and movement.
So just to build on what we present in the course, we present a whole set of tools, what we call the trauma-informed toolkit, and in each module we present several tools and teach you how to integrate them into your classroom in a very practical way. So you receive audio and video practices, visual aids, exercises, discussion boards, and you essentially learn how to use the tools experientially. You really get to feel how this plays out in your own body and in your own nervous system. And then there's a weekly webinar that allows us to facilitate participants directly in whatever is coming up for you, whatever questions you have, as well as what's coming up in your own classroom. And our desire with this is really to create a durable container for this kind of work, so that, so many of us, as I know that most of the people here are from ACME, so many of us are doing this work of contemplative practices, embodied work within universities. And I think one desire that we have is really to create a durable container for this kind of work in the classroom, so that there's continuing support for professors to be able to continue to share the work implemented in your classroom for the quarters following the course. So it's not just like you take a course and then it's done. You continue to receive support for it. So Angelica, do you want to speak about the summary? I think maybe we're ready to move to questions now, but
Yeah. Did you want me to go over this?
Well, I feel like we've spoken to this already. So, but if you think there's anything here that you want to underscore.
I think the only thing I would say is that, as you were saying in the course, the opportunity here is to have some facilitation with your own personal overwhelm and understand and be educated in ways that you can implement the things that you're learning into your classroom. And then you can feel good about being a professor again and not just in overwhelm, and that you feel that you have creative solutions, but also not just taking something and having to give it to somebody else, but to have something for yourself so you can teach that to others, because it's a natural byproduct of why you got into teaching, which is, I'm sure, to be able to offer and educate and give people and be of service to young people, to create possibilities and to help them potentiate in their lives and to support them in that process. So the facilitation aspect of this program is really to give you a lot of support to build the muscles that you need in your own resiliency, and to really see that as that the course isn't about trying to give you more to do. It's more about offering you a foundation for, again, increasing your own window of tolerance so that you can reside more in the being and less in the doing. And that's a state where we are optimally capable of not only facilitating and giving to others, but receiving the richness that happens in the relationship of communities of giving and receiving between students and professors. That is what brings value to our lives as teachers and students' lives as learners, is that it's the relationships that build the community. And when you are more resolved in yourself around being and not having to just be an overwhelm in doing, that really allows for that to happen. And it makes you feel empowered again in your work and not overwhelmed and having to worry about security and bureaucracy and all the things that I think take away the richness of life. And we have to fight for that. We have to advocate for that in ourselves. And this is an opportunity for you to advocate for yourself, that you value your own being enough to be able to make that choice, so that you can still continue to inspire students and create with them what got you into this to begin with.
Yeah, and I would just say to that, just as throughout my time in academia, I started doing work with trauma while I was in graduate school. And so it's been from the beginning of my time in academia that I've been integrating these kinds of practices into my classroom. And I have to say that even at the most basic level, even if you were to just bring in the practice that Angelica showed you today of just grounding into your classroom, that in and of itself is tremendously transformative. And for me to have had the sense of support and really prioritizing my own support, my own regulation of my nervous system throughout my academic career was the most transformative thing that ever happened to me in academia and professionally and personally. So I just want to say that. And I think now we'd love to hear what your questions are and speak to what's coming up in your classroom, what's coming up around any questions you have about the material that we presented. Maya is going to field the questions for us, I believe.
Yes, I am. Thank you both, Anita and Angelica, for everything you've shared thus far. Many questions have been coming in throughout, which is great. So if you haven't submitted your question, you can feel free to do so now as we're going through the ones that have already been submitted. I do see at least one person with their hand raised, so I'm just going to ask that you submit your question or your comment in the question field on the control panel. And so one of the questions that came up in a few different ways that I think would be a good place to start, noting that it's a complex topic, and we can't rush into learning some of these skill building tools that you've mentioned. But if people are hungry for concrete examples and some maybe some tips or advice for how to begin the process of incorporating this into curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Should I start, Angelica? Yeah. Well, so first I would say, just in terms of, concrete things that you can do immediately, I would say that, even if it's just to take like the practice that Angelica did is actually a very, it's a potentially simple practice in the sense of just taking a little time at the beginning of your class to give students the chance to just feel their feet, for example, just feel their sit bones, is a simple practice that any of us could do at the beginning of our class. And what it signals to students is, I respect your experience. I respect the fact that you may need a moment at the beginning of class just to feel yourself. And that in and of itself doesn't need to take very much time, and it's something that we can begin. And that is in itself a trauma-informed tool. That's where we begin our course. I also think that practices of inquiry, that's something that we stress a lot in the program, are a really good way to just jump in and bring trauma-informed tools into the classroom. And what that entails is just giving students a little bit of time, maybe at the beginning of the class or throughout, depending on how you're structuring it, to journal on a few sets of questions that allow them to connect their personal experience to either the coursework that you're talking about for the day, or to to give them the chance to reflect on what's happened for them maybe during the course of the pandemic. Right now everybody's going back to school, right? And this moment of beginning, I think, is such a fundamental moment right now that we have to really include all that's happened in these months, right? We really have to acknowledge that this thing that we're calling the university right now is not what it was 4 months ago, right? That we've all been through so much. And so giving them a chance just to answer a few questions, journal about them, and that can easily be done online, about take a moment just to reflect about what has come up for you over the last several months in the course of the pandemic. What have been your challenges? What have been your resources?
Right. Welcome. We're here online. We know this is different, and I'm sure many of you, like myself, have been really challenged to go back and forth and find out which way is up and down. So we're going to take a few minutes. First, I'm just going to give you a little practice. It's an orienting practice, so that when we're here online together, you don't have to be staring at the screen and get overwhelmed by having to be like this all the time. So I'm going to take a few minutes to ground you right now, and we're going to take a break at 45 minutes in the class, and I'm going to have you sit back and put down your pencils and your pens and get away from the screen for a moment and just have a look around the room and just kind of name what's in your environment. Do you see light coming through the window? Do you see your dog? Do you see whatever it is? Just giving people an opportunity to, again, do a weather check when they come in, meaning write down what their experience is so they can include all of them into the room, breaking up the class for 2 minutes so that they can get off of the technology of the experience and resource themselves by just feeling their feet, getting your attention off the screen. These are regulating practices, including parts of ourselves. In that small way, you're saying, I see you. I see you, and I'm including you. And we're going to learn, but I'm going to take you along. I'm going to take all of you along with me right now. We're going to go on this journey together, and we're not going to leave any part of us behind. And I'm going to add these little threads of inquiry that are going to support that part of you without ever having to get into necessarily the nitty-gritty detail of what it is in this moment, but I can still include that part of you.
Thank you so much. And I think, Angelica, the last piece that you added speaks to a lot of the kind of unknown that folks are facing in terms of bringing things to an online environment. And that certainly came up in the questions as well. So another question that was touched on by a few folks refers to Resmaa Menakem's discussions around doing work in racial affinity groups. And for folks who teach at predominantly white institutions where their classrooms are predominantly white students, are there some thoughts around doing trauma work in these unbalanced environments, especially when many of this individual's white students haven't done much work around their own racial identity?
Well, I would say, first of all, that I do think it's actually a great idea to use affinity groups. I teach at a university that's largely white, and as a person of color, I'm often, I I feel very conscious and also protective of the fact that I have, students of color, there are many fewer of them than white students, and that maybe it's possible if they're in smaller groups with one another to have conversations that aren't so centered by whiteness, which I think can often happen. So I think, first of all, I would say that. But, second of all, I think the thing is that a lot of these practices, I think, should be done by everybody before you ever begin to have any of these conversations, because the point of them is to create an environment in which you're down-regulating people's nervous systems and creating conditions for people to have honest conversations and connected experiences. And so in that case, it's like, it's not that we have to have only the students of color doing one practice and the white students doing another practice, or, to divide it up in that way. In fact, I've taught in prisons for quite a long time. And, I would say, and that's a population that's brought together students from university with students who are incarcerated folks. And so that's a great level of difference in privilege, the racial differences, age differences. But all of the practices that we did were ones that brought, that allowed people to reflect more deeply on their own experience and also to connect with one another. And it was never necessary really to the decentering of privilege happened as a byproduct of the practices. And so I actually think that that's usually what will happen. And of course, when certain things, specific issues around race come up, then we can address those as they come up with specific practices.
Great, thank you. So the next question is from someone who teaches a class on art and trauma at an art school, who is looking for advice on how to redirect from a therapeutic direction so as not to cross any ethical boundaries when receiving personal information from their students.
I feel like we would need a little bit more specificity around that, because I think the specifics matter. I think one thing, I don't know if this would address it, but what I would say is that there's always a fundamental ability to express confidentiality with someone. I'm not sure what the question is. I think I need more specifics about what it is that what is the boundary that you don't want to cross? Does it have to do with the inquiry of their experience, or does it have to do with they've divulged something that you want to feel that there's a container around? I'm not quite sure. Do you understand, Anita?
I mean, I think part of what they might be referring to is that in universities as professors, we have to deal with the fact that, if students divulge certain kinds of information to us, then we are legally bound to report some of that information. Like, for example, we have Title IX rules within universities. So students share certain types of, that something was done to them in certain ways, we would have to report that. And so I think maybe part of what, I'm not sure exactly, I think I would like more information too, but I think it sounds like what the question is about is how can we deepen conversations, but then not to the point where we're having to cross that boundary of receiving information that we then would have to report in some way, which I think can be a very, very challenging place. And we have to let our students know in the beginning if there are things that we would be legally bound to report, that they need to be aware of that in the beginning. But I think, as what Angelica was trying to speak to, I think is that we can create, we can create within that container, we can create a lot of safety around confidentiality and sharing, and have rules. I've had many classes where there's really a deep level of sharing around history, stuff that we would never ever want to share outside of that room. And I think that needs to be fundamental. But then I think also what I heard in that question is, it also sounds like this professor, because it's about art and trauma, right? It's easy for classes to potentially, if you're opening that door, for them to go perhaps more in that direction than that professor wanted. And so I think that we just have to be, I don't know, I think we have to hold boundaries with our students around, what are the parameters of sharing also, so that there's a level of safety around what comes up in the classroom, because otherwise I think it can get very complicated.
So what I would say about that is, and I think this is the direction I was going in, is that if there are legally binding agreements that you have with the institution, that you get very clear about what your own agreement is in terms of confidentiality with your students, and that you name both of those in the beginning of a class, so that you feel that container is there underneath the container of the larger whole. The other principle that I really like and tool is the principle of the no, meaning being able to allow yourself and other people to hold a boundary around what you cannot go into with someone. And I think even in this case, if you're a professor, you have to use that, advocate for that, because it would put you in a very dangerous situation to get caught between wanting to be loyal to a student's confidentiality and also a larger binding agreement that you have. So that puts you in a very difficult position. So I think being able to advocate for people to have a no, and that includes you, because you don't want to get put in that situation, allows you to have a little more space within that. There's more breathing room between those two containers. And I think then you've also given them the best possible place of resiliency within that, so that they're informed about their decision, and you can kind of mitigate that possible rupture and betrayal from capitulating again if you can set up those containers ahead of time, or those agreements. Basically, they give you some buffer room.
Yeah, I just want to confirm that the individual who asked the question said that this has been very helpful, and I think that was great. Thank you. And the creating of a container can be used in many ways in the classroom and on the online classroom environment. So that was a great topic to mention. So the next question is coming from someone who is in the STEM field, whose own traumatic experience has been that students actively resist practices and name them as harming, and that sharing the thoughts about the ways of inviting students into becoming open to attempting new ways of being, not just doing, would be greatly appreciated.
Can you read the last sentence again?
Yeah, that sharing some thoughts about ways of inviting students into becoming open to attempting new ways of being, not just doing, would be greatly appreciated. And I'm
Can I go
just sending
first?
that. I'm sending that to you as well, Angelica, so you can read that.
Okay, thanks. Can I go first? Is it okay? I think there are two things. One is inquiry. Maybe if you're dealing with groups or resistance at that level, inquiry, self-reflective assignments. Inquiry about what was your experience of that? What's the greatest challenge for you in that right now? Can you name or acknowledge one thing about that particular passage of racial violence that affected you personally? What did you notice in your awareness? Some questions like that, inquiry. The other thing is sometimes it's useful to, I think sometimes when you're dealing with people who have that level of resistance, the resistance may also, and this is just my intuition from what you're saying, it feels like that person or that group, if it's more than one, that's an authority issue thing. So that isn't really necessarily about resistance to just being in the body or being open to new perceptions. It's really about feeling like they have to submit to somebody else's authority about how they connect with who they are. So one of the ways that the social nervous system works is that if I were in that classroom and I was experiencing that, take it off your shoulders. It's not your you're not accountable to that, because that's that person's authority issues. You cannot solve that problem. So the way to go around it is first to recognize it's not your issue. And even though you're the professor, you're not in an agreement with them to take on their projection about why authority isn't okay for them, right? They have an agreement with you to learn something. So again, this is about agreements in different containers. What I would do in that setting is break it up by offering exercises where they work with other students and they get empowered in their authority through themselves by getting the exercise, not from you giving it to them as the professor, but a facilitation within a triad or a dyad, and through inquiry in that process with other people in the classroom, so that that particular dynamic of power and authority is not as triggered.
Yeah, I think all of that is exactly what I would say, but also I would just say, I know that you're in a STEM field, the person who asked the question, so you're in the sciences, and I just want to say, I'm in political science, which is not a STEM field, but on the other hand, it's a weird field in the sense of I've encountered similar kinds of resistance from students who are very left-brained, who are very rational, who have some idea of what the discipline is, and that somehow what I do is not what that discipline is. I mean, if you consider what many professors, for example, who are in my discipline do, it resembles nothing like what I consider learning to be, right? So, and I think that might be a version of something that you're confronting as well, that you're trying to bring this kind of other paradigm within a scientific field, and you have students who are being primed by all the, by the general environment, that to think that that's not what learning is. And so I think that there's, I would say all of what Angelica said, but then also that there needs to be some way of just slowly titrating, dropping in little drops of how you can integrate that different kind of paradigm within your discipline. Whether it's just assigning an article by somebody who who can kind of speak to that, or just having a conversation, also bigger conversation about science and about questioning some of the paradigms in can be an interesting way also of dealing with it at the level of the discipline. Because I think also there's a real, we have to take, we're vulnerable. We're absolutely vulnerable when we're trying to do these kinds of innovative things within our disciplines, but I think that we have to take those risks, and we really have to kind of stand up for what we believe in, because otherwise our disciplines are really not sustainable, or not really creating a space for us to do what learning really means to us, right? So I just want to say I appreciate the work that you're doing, and I think that we need to fight this fight.
I like what you said about a simple, like an article that's like maybe deviates from the more like empirical scientific research or data that's out there. Perhaps you yourself have been interested in some versions of, because these fields start to overlap when you get into neuroscience, and when you start exploring consciousness and perception. The fields start to, quantum physics, the fields start to really overlap: consciousness, perception, and science. So if you can, like Anita said, there's a suture or a little thread that you can bring along the way. Maybe you don't get to change all that much of the practices, but you do a really profound inquiry and compel them to reflect on those things, just to kind of maybe open up and create a little more plasticity in the brain. I think that broadening perception and creating more fluid consciousness is intelligent. It's emotionally intelligent, it's resiliency, it's creativity, and that's never going to harm anyone. That isn't about dogma. It's not about forcing any new paradigm in anyone's down their throat, or in any way, I think, offensive. I think it's just a way of helping any person, whatever their discipline is, to expand their awareness and their possibilities. And I think there's many ways to do that, even inviting in an interesting, obscure woman of color as a scientist who did her own research. There's so many ways to open those doorways of perception.
Thank you both so much for those responses. This next question you touched on a little and is directly related, I think. But the question is about educators building their courage to do this work. So, you know, someone who obviously acknowledges the importance of trauma-informed teaching, but doesn't know if they're going to be able to handle it well, or are afraid of causing harm. So, what might some of those first steps look like based on your experience?
Well, you know, what I would say, I think this is such a fundamental question because I really do believe that it takes a lot of courage to do this kind of work within academia. I've been doing this since the beginning of my academic career, before I had a tenure track job and before I, you know, had any protection within academia. And I think, as we all know, those of us who do work with contemplative practices, embodied practices within academia, they've become more popular over the last decade, right? But, you know, 14 years ago or whatnot, there really was a lot less space within academia for these kinds of practices. And what I would say is just that I think that, first of all, just knowing that it's not going to always feel good to be doing this kind of work and to be pushing up against the grain of, you know, the forms of knowledge that our universities have been prioritizing for a really long time, right? Because what we're coming up against really is a much bigger societal issue that's you know, very old, actually, about patriarchal constructs of knowledge, around colonial constructs of knowledge. And you know, we as individuals, to try to push up against those issues, you know, it's a lot for an individual to hold, right? What I would say is that what's beautiful about this work, and what's beautiful about you know, what we teach in the program, I think, and what I've learned throughout all of this, through Angelica's work, has been that we really need to prioritize supporting ourselves as we delve into this kind of work. So, you know, learning how to find places of resource and support within our classroom as we begin to bring embodied practices in is going to be fundamental. And for each of us, that's going to be something different. Maybe it's going to be about, you know, it'll be about how do we settle ourselves in our own nervous systems before we come to class, or what kind of embodied practices feel like the right thing to do at the beginning of class. Or maybe we need to take a pause in the middle of class and kind of learn how to, you know, give ourselves the time to downregulate, right? There's so many different ways, but I think even just the question of acknowledging, like, yes, a lot of fear comes up when you do this kind of work, because it's not the norm. And even though there are many more of us doing this now than there were before, it's a risk. We take a lot of risks, especially if we don't have tenure, or we don't have protection, or if we're a person of color or whatnot. And so I think acknowledging that it does take risk and that it's worth it, but that, you know, we need to seek support and create safety for ourselves.
That's great. And just to add on to what Anita was saying, I think that it does take tremendous courage. And if you're someone, I think, as Maya was saying, that you already believe in this work in some way, then you focus on that place that you believe in something and you're willing to have the courage to do so. I think, you know, what John Lewis said, in a way, it's like, this is your advocacy. This is where you get into a little bit of good trouble. And that good trouble can look like just the small bit of overcoming that fear of resistance to bring something new into your classroom. And I would say that the beautiful thing about this work is that it has an inherent intelligence to it. It is not intellectual learning that you're going to then take in and then translate into your classroom like a book that you read that you're then reporting on. This is about your body. It's about the whole of you getting the support and the resources that you need. And the byproduct is that you often have the confidence to bring in something that you know, because you know it in your body. And when you have that knowing, the risk of bringing it in is not as great, because there's something organic about the unfolding of that process. The greater risk would be that there's some fear around not fitting into the institutional system. But if you go slowly, right, and you, like Anita was saying, titrate and just bring a little bit at a time, you don't, little, what is it, small, a little bit is much more than a lot. right? A little bit at a time. And because in truth, it is the presence and the being. We learn through vibration more than anything else. And so when you are in that place of presence, the tool is not as important as how you transmit it to someone, because it's in your knowing. So there's all kinds of little ways to bring this in that you will have full confidence that you can do that. And like Anita said, whatever that is, whatever little piece of that is, and then you build on that. You keep building on that worked, that created this experience, what wants to come up next? So that's the creative relational place. And I think this is how we advocate for what we believe in. You know, it takes courage, and it is good trouble.
Maya, I just want to ask that just at the end, could we just take like 1 or 2 minutes we want to tell the participants that some future webinars we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this next question is about, I'm sorry, I just lost it. Just bear with me. So this question is more about things on an institutional level, and some ideas about how we might work towards helping to create connection and embodied presence, and what might this look like beyond individual educators building their skills.
Yeah, well, this is something we were thinking about a lot. Like what we really envision is having cohorts of people who are supported by their institutions to bring these kinds of practices to classrooms in a bigger way. You know, that we think that, also bringing in administrators in to kind of also show how this isn't really just something about the classroom, it's something about a cultural change within universities, right? And administrators also, they need support for their overwhelm in this time, right? So do every single person at universities needs these kind of tools, staff, as well as students. And so, one thing we envision is that universities can really see the need on a layered level to bring these kinds of tools so that we can have a campus that's trauma informed, that we can start to create institutional change through that kind of support. So that's what we envision.
Great, thank you. So the next question, jumping back to online learning environments for a moment. You mentioned some new ways of using technology, and this individual is curious about some of those specifics.
Well, one thing we'd say, we're less about new uses of the technology than we are about how do we navigate the technology in a kind of embodied and oriented way. And maybe Angelica could speak to that, because I think that's a big part of the practices that we're trying to teach. Or
I think part of it is understanding what is the interface of technology doing in the classroom. What is it taking away, and what is it adding? Because there are things that it brings to the table that are not necessarily things that we get when we're in a classroom setting. Interestingly enough, I think it's a not thought out experience yet to believe that the technology only takes things away. I think that when we really sit with it, you'll find, and I know this because I've taught a lot of online courses in very specific, particular, very intimate personal work. And there are ways in which things can happen through the technology that you might not be able to utilize in the same way in a classroom, and vice versa. So I think it's about thinking about it differently and understanding at a deeper level how to use the platform and particular tricks of the trade, I guess you could say, that would allow you to get the result you want and have success, and not feel like you are trying to fit your experience of teaching in a classroom into the computer and into this platform. It's really about exploring that and how that takes the pressure off of the professor, takes the pressure off of the students, and the result of that is more engagement and engagement in a different way. And that's something that I've spent quite a bit of time exploring and understanding, and really feeling deeply surprised by the fact that there are ways that we can grow. You know, it's interesting that we are more likely to open up to different levels of connection because we got disconnected physically because of the pandemic. So, you know, there's always a window that opens for opportunity. Amidst the chaos, there's creativity and possibility, and that's the case with this as well.
Thank you so much. I think that's actually a perfect note to end on, as that will be the last question. And I completely agree with you, Angelica, that some amazing things can happen during virtual learning experiences. So thank you for that. And thank you both so much for everything that you've shared. This has been such a rich dialogue, and I'm so glad that so much time was left for questions. So Anita, you wanted a few moments just to talk a little more specifically about the program?
Well, actually, two things. Yes, to tell you when the program begins next. So I'm just gonna click some slides here very quickly, which is you can register for our fall session, which is gonna start September 27th and go till November 8th. So we just wanted to let you know about that, and our website will be sending to you with our follow-up materials. And then the other thing we wanted to say is that we wanted to tell you that we have 2 upcoming free webinars, which are coming up. The next one is next week. It's the skill of resourcing in the trauma-informed classroom. And we've kind of envisioned these as a series. So if you've done this one now today, this one would be a great way to just continue the conversation. So we'd love to have you. You can get information about registering by, we'll send you it actually in the follow-up materials so you can register. And then also we'll have one the following week that's about, the title of it is Embodied Leadership in a Time of Overwhelm, a webinar to support administrators. Because as you know, as we were trying to speak to before with the question about institutions, we really want to support every layer of universities to be able to have these tools, not just professors in classrooms, but also administrators, department heads, staff, deans, provosts. So if you are interested in kind of bringing this conversation in a bigger way to your universities, please tell your administrators, because they need support too. And if you yourself are an administrator, please do join us for that. And so that's all that we wanted to tell you for now.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your time and for inviting us to join here.
Thank you both so much. And yes, to everyone who's still on, we will be including all of this information as well as a link to the recording in a follow-up email. And I just want to quickly remind folks that the Center for Contemplative Mind is really just 3 full-time staff members, and your donations really do help make a difference no matter what the size. We know we've been trying to continue to provide resources and support, and that's donations will help us do that. So please visit contemplativemind.org to learn all about our upcoming events, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you again, Anita and Angelica, and everyone on. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.